Mann to take up his 18 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, the Treasurer and I agree on one thing. Australia's 24 years of uninterrupted economic growth should be celebrated, and even more importantly, it should be protected. It's a remarkable achievement, the longest period of uninterrupted economic growth for any developed country in the history of the world. Many people are responsible for it, but it's our responsibility to ensure it continues. And I agree with the Treasurer that it is not inevitable that it continues. Vigilance and reform are necessary. We agree on the end, continuing those 24 years of uninterrupted economic growth. Economic growth lifts people out of poverty and turns aspiration into reality. But we disagree, Madam Speaker, on the method. The Treasurer says the way to protect our economic growth record, our living standards, is to embrace his budget, which, to our way of thinking, is a fundamentally unfair document. He effectively says that the way to protect Australia's living standards is to attack Australia's living standards through the budget. The Treasurer's approach and the government's approach is that unfairness and regressive policies are the basis for reform, and that reform must be unfair. This is where we differ. The Treasurer, with due respect, has not learnt the lessons of history. The most successful reforming period in Australia's economic history was that period between 1983 and 1996. Never before had Australia been asked to embrace so much economic change, so much reform, so much change, and fairness was at its core. The talisman of the Hawke and Keating governments was restraint with equity. Equity was important. It was important for reasons of justice, but it was also important because it enabled Prime Minister Hawke and Treasurer Keating to make the case for reform, to explain to the Australian people that it was in the best interest of everybody to reform. If their reform package had been fundamentally unfair, it would have failed, and Australia would have been worse off. That is the difference of approach between this side of the House and that side of the House. We embrace economic reform. We do not run from it. We embrace it. We acknowledge that it is necessary to ensure ongoing growth, but we reject completely and utterly economic reform based on unfairness. At the core is the Treasurer's philosophy, which underpins his budget, which he shared with the House and with the people on Budget Night, dividing Australia into lifters and leaners. This is where we differ. The way to make the case for reform is not to divide Australia down the middle. The way to make the case for reform is not to say some Australians deserve to benefit from economic growth and others do not. This is what he was doing when he announced that the government would attempt to introduce unfair indexation for Australia's aged pensioners. This is what he was doing when he announced that he would take away family tax benefit for children over 6. This is what he was doing when he announced that the government believed it was necessary to create an underclass by taking people under 30 off New Start allowance. And this is what they were doing when they announced that low-income earners would receive zero tax support for saving for their future through superannuation. These are at the core of the government's philosophy and the government's approach. Now, it was a regrettable thing for the Treasurer to say, to divide Australia into lifters and leaners, because, as has been said, what actually unites Australians is much greater than what divides us. And we believe in this side of the House in inclusive growth. And by that we mean that every Australian should be able to contribute to the growth and every Australian should benefit from economic growth. Every single Australian. We do not divide Australians into lifters and leaners. Now, the Treasurer was not being original when he coined this phrase. He adopted the phrase from another politician. That politician was the vice-presidential candidate of the Republican Party, a Tea Party adherent, who said, Madam Speaker, that America was divided into makers and takers, adapted by the Treasurer. Now, in fairness, that candidate for the vice-presidency said that that was a mistake. He withdrew that statement. He was campaigning, and an American citizen went up to him and said to him, "Can you explain to me who the takers are? Is it my aged pensioner mother, who worked her whole life, who's now relying on the federal government, the United States federal government, for the aged pension? Is she a taker?" And he reflected on that, and he decided that constituent, that United States citizen, was right. and he shouldn't have said that, and he withdrew it and he recanted it, and he's done so very explicitly and very deliberately. I say to the Treasurer, through you, Madam Speaker, he too should recant and withdraw that statement about lifters and leaders in Australia. He should acknowledge that Australia does not need a Treasurer who divides Australians, but one who unites them. Now, Madam Speaker, the Treasurer talked of economic growth. As I said in my opening remarks, we on this side of the House do not run from economic growth. We embrace it. We are the party of economic growth. Economic growth lifts people from poverty into prosperity. That is what drives the Labor Party, Madam Speaker. We will embrace things which promote economic growth, and we will criticise things which take away from economic growth. And we say creating an Australia which is more fundamentally unfair does not promote growth, it diminishes growth. It will in the long run be seen as a threat to growth, and the government should recognise the same. Now, we talk of long-run economic growth, long-term economic growth. Let me take a moment, Madam Treasurer, to point out the things in the budget which eat away. Madam Speaker, there are rumours about reshuffles, Madam Speaker, but I haven't heard that one. In fairness, I haven't heard that one. Madam Treasurer, Madam Speaker, let us focus on those matters in which the Treasurer is eating away at those long-term creators of economic growth, and let us focus in particular on education and innovation. Now, the budget contained, despite claims to the contrary, $80 billion worth of cuts to health and education, $28 billion in education. Now, what is the long-term impact on economic growth of this? You see, Madam Speaker, on this side of the House, we believe that every Australian, regardless of their parents' wealth, regardless of their location around Australia, should have the capacity to grow, to be whatever they wish to be, to their full and maximum potential. We believe that as a matter of fundamental social justice. Absolutely. But we also believe it as very good economic policy as well, because we believe that if those young people are able to grow, to be everything that they can be, then Australia's economy as a whole will be better off. And I'm not the only one who thinks it, Madam Speaker. For example, there are studies that show that measures to increase school retention rates would result in an additional annual taxation receipt for the Commonwealth of $2.3 billion by 2040. Or the effect of increasing school and training retention rates amongst 15 to 24-year-olds from the current 80% mark to around 90% would have the same positive impact on the economy as increasing Australia's total migrant intake by 180,000 over the period to 2040, would have a similar economic impact as increasing workforce participation rates of older workers by 6.6 percentage points, from nearly 53% to nearly 60%. And it would boost annual GDP by 1.1%, the equivalent of $9.2 billion in today's figures. This is the transformational generational impact of an investment in education. Again, there's a difference here. We see every dollar spent on education in this nation as an investment. Every single dollar. We see it as an investment in Australia's economic future as well as the future of those individuals. And let's look at a moment, Madam Speaker, at the issue of skills and vocational education and training, another area cut by this Treasurer and by this government. Now, this is an area where we can make a huge difference for individuals, their careers and their lives, and for the Australian economy. For example, closing the equity gap between people from low socio-economic status backgrounds and the general population through vocational education and training is estimated to increase real GDP by $3.9 billion by 2020, and in doing so would generate over 37,000 full-time equivalent jobs. That's an investment in the future, good for Australia's economy. Or closing the equity gap between Indigenous people and people with a disability and the general population through vocational education and training is estimated to increase real GDP by $12.12 billion by 2020 and to generate 118,000 full-time equivalent jobs. This is the transformational opportunity of vocational education and training for our nation, one being eaten away by the short-sighted cuts of the Liberal Party and National Party in office. This is what we talk about when we say this is a budget that is anti-economic growth. I accept the intentions of the Treasurer when he talks about the need for economic growth, but I say to him through you, Madam Speaker, this government's actions eat away at the future sources of economic growth. And then we come to innovation, that other great area, that other great source of economic growth for Australia into the future. Well, this is a budget which has cut the CSIRO funding, and just in the last fortnight we've seen the impact of that. The impact of that cut. A cut in the CSIRO staffing levels which is very dramatic and which will do Australia harm for many years to come. We all know that science and research is primarily driven by the private sector, as it should be. But what governments do is important. We know that the CSIRO invented Wi-Fi. We know that the equivalent authorities and agencies in the United States and in the United Kingdom were integral to promoting the internet and the GPS. We know that. But we know that it is much less likely to happen in the future with these cuts. And we've seen many organisations abolished. The Treasurer boasted in his economic statement about the number of government organisations that have been abolished. Well, several of them are in the innovation, research and commercialisation space. That is not a matter for boasting, Madam Speaker. That is a matter for disappointment and, frankly, a matter for shame. Because of all the matters in the budget, which we are critical of, and they are many and they are varied, these are perhaps the most short-sighted and, frankly, the dumbest cuts of all, because Australia will pay a price for many, many years to come. And I want to talk to Madam Speaker about the impact in the shorter term of economic growth of this government's economic policies, and the budget in particular. Now, the Treasurer again talked about confidence in his ministerial statement. And it is something we should talk about. We should talk about confidence, because confidence has been smashed by this budget. Confidence fell by 7 percentage points in the month following the budget. Consumer confidence. It is 13% lower than it was at the time of the last election. We were promised an adrenaline charge, and we've had the opposite. And that, Madam Speaker, is on the Westpac figures. The Treasurer prefers to use the ANZ figures. Well, let's use them. Let's use the ANZ figures, Madam Speaker. The ANZ figures aren't seasonally adjusted, but I'm happy to use them if the Treasurer wants to use them. That's fine with me. The yearly average for this year is on the index 111.4. The index for the last 10 years, the average is 115.2, and for the last 15 years, 116.4. It is not correct. It is not correct to say. That's right, and that includes the GFC. It is not correct to say that consumer confidence has returned to its long-term average, as the Treasurer claims. In fact, it is at its equal lowest level, and it is lower than it has been at any time, putting aside the GFC, since 1993. 1993. And this is about the budget. It's about the Treasurer's rhetoric, which is ill-judged and irresponsible. The Treasurer's rhetoric in the lead-up to the budget was talking up a budget crisis. And the Australian people listened. The Australian people listen, as they do when a Treasurer speaks, and they put away their wallets, and Australian businesses have paid the price for the Treasurer's ill-judged rhetoric. And Australian families have paid the price for the Treasurer's ill-judged rhetoric and his actions in the lead-up to the budget and since. And the Australian people and Australian consumers have also responded to the mixed messages from the government. Yep. The lack of an economic strategy, the lack of an economic narrative. One day we're told it's fine. The budget's been 75% passed. What are you worried about? Everything's dandy. The next day we've got a crisis on our hands because of that terrible Labor Party standing up for what they believe in, standing up for fairness. How dare they? They're blocking our budget. Well, can Australian consumers be forgiven for being confused? If the Treasurer was competent, the Australian people would be confident, Madam Speaker. But he's not, and they are not. This is the impact of this government on consumer confidence. And consumer confidence has a big impact on business activity. And the people who analyse these figures have been very clear about what's caused this reduction in consumer confidence. Let's have another look, Madam Speaker, at the Westpac survey. Westpac's chief economist, Bill Evans, said in November, in relation to the November results, this is an unsurprising but still disappointing result. Unsurprising because the Australian people and the commentators have become used to this government. And clearly this is sheeted home directly to the budget. I note that in July, a record 74% of those surveyed recalled news on budget and taxation. 74. The highest recall rate of a budget in the history of the survey. 74% said this was what was leading to their reduction in confidence.
This is their year of achievement.
And they went on to say the recollections were extremely unfavourable and are likely to have remained that way. And guess what? Later on, there was another survey which was the second worst. The second worst in relation to negative recall of the budget. So they have got some achievements, they have got some records. The worst and the second worst when it comes to impact on consumer confidence of this budget. That is the result of this government's approach. And so, Madam Speaker, we do have a different plan for Australia. We do have a different vision for Australia. We say very clearly the budget should be on a credible path back to surplus. It should be on a credible path back to surplus. We would support sensible measures to return the budget to surplus, as we have supported more than $20 billion worth of savings through this House and the other House. We have and we would support it. But we will support measures that are fair, and we will never support measures that are unfair, because they are bad for Australian families and bad for the economy, and we won't stand for it. We believe in economic reform with equity at its core. And economic reform with equity at its core is better for the nation as well as being better for Australian families. We'll embrace the age of entrepreneurialism. We'll embrace innovation. We will lead that debate. The competitiveness report released by the government was a damp squib of a report. A report which was full of excuses. Government announcements which we welcomed to the degree that they went to, as far as they went. It was a long time coming and disappointing when it was released. But we'll support and had supported those measures. But we'll point out that these measures go nowhere near far enough when taken against the $113 million of cuts to the CSIRO, the 1,391 jobs lost by the CSIRO, a 21.5% reduction in their workforce. These aren't small numbers, Madam Speaker. A 21.5% reduction in the workforce of the CSIRO that Australia's economic growth rate will pay a price for many years to come. So, Madam Speaker, as we end this parliamentary year, let there be no doubt the Labor Party will always be the party of economic growth. We believe in it, we'll promote it, and in government we'll deliver it. And we'll deliver it for the best interests of all Australians. We won't choose lifters and leaners. We will say every Australian should benefit from economic growth, and every Australian should be encouraged to contribute to that economic growth to the best of their ability and capacity. That'll be the approach of a Shorten Labor government. That'll be the contest of ideas undertaken in this chamber next year. That'll be the contest of ideas undertaken across the nation. It's a contest of ideas we intend to participate in and win.